The U.S. Navy claims that a 30-hour fire, one crippling a $13 billion supercarrier, was caused by nothing but laundry lint. But if you talk to the sailors who survived a grueling 9-month deployment on the USS Gerald R. Ford, you hear a different tale. Today, we tear down the official narrative to reveal why they replaced this flagship in the Middle East with a 50-year-old Nimitz carrier. On paper, the United States boasts a massive fleet of 11 active aircraft carriers perfectly ready for deployment right now. In reality, we are fighting a dangerous multi-front proxy war globally, with only 2 active decks fully ready for any real combat action. The abrupt withdrawal of the USS Gerald R. Ford is not just about a suspicious onboard fire or faulty electromagnetic catapult systems. It is a massive red flag showing a terribly broken maintenance cycle and exhausted crews hitting their absolute physical breaking point. This situation reveals a desperate naval strategy stretched far beyond its limits in multiple highly contested geopolitical theaters. Today, we will examine these systemic failures and decode exactly what the Pentagon is desperately trying to hide from the general public. 5 weeks into Operation Epic Fury, 60 Iranian warships have been completely destroyed in this intense and brutal naval conflict. Massive missile factories have been turned into rubble, and air defense networks are simply gone in exactly 72 intense hours. And yet the flagship of this powerful siege, the USS Gerald R. Ford, sits inactive safely away in a distant port located in Split, Croatia. We must skip the redundant history of ship classes because the real crisis lies within the stark numbers of fleet rotational reality. The Pentagon's desire for global force projection has finally collided with the harsh math of fleet rotational reality across the globe. If you look at a strategic map, you will realize that the mighty fleet is actually crippled by a massive and growing maintenance backlog. 8 or 9 of our supercarriers are trapped in dry docks right now, stuck undergoing basic refitting or extensive training qualification. This is the unyielding rule of threes in naval deployment strategy, dictating that it takes 3 ships to keep just 1 actively deployed. One carrier actively conducts combat operations on the volatile front lines, projecting power against hostile foreign military adversaries. The second massive vessel is preparing to relieve the first one, loading essential weapons and running complex combat readiness scenarios. The third ship is completely torn apart in a domestic shipyard right now, repairing the deep structural damage of its previous combat tour. This geometry was built to be an unbreakable operational shield, but unfortunately it was never a truly complete strategic equation at all. When Operation Epic Fury aggressively launched on February 28th, there were drastically fewer assets available than the public knew. The strategy required 3 invincible supercarriers deployed simultaneously across 3 heavily contested global maritime choke points. Only 2 vessels were actually positioned on the vast ocean map when this unprecedented and highly hostile international crisis finally hit. The USS Abraham Lincoln aggressively held the critical Arabian Sea, locking down the vital Strait of Hormuz safely from the eastern flank. The USS George H.W. Bush was still sitting at the Norfolk Naval Base, totally unavailable to cover the final and most critical vertex point. Trapped in basic certification cycles, the Bush left the Ford alone to execute the grueling duties of 2 different active supercarriers. The strategic coffin was perfectly drawn on the Pentagon whiteboard with 3 impenetrable walls surrounding hostile Iranian territories. In truth, the grand plan was always 2 severely overworked carriers, desperately stretching to cover 3 critical strategic naval gaps. To truly understand what happened to the USS Gerald R. Ford, you cannot simply start with the unexpected laundry room fire. You must rewind the clock exactly 9 months and 18 days before the catastrophic internal technical systems failure. On June 24th of the previous year, the massive vessel left the Norfolk Naval Base for a standard 6-month tour. The original mission profile was standard NATO exercises in the Mediterranean with a predictable rotational maintenance cycle. Complex warships rely heavily on a selected restricted availability, or SRA, to reset their highly intricate digital systems. Tragically, the USS Gerald R. Ford was pushed dangerously far past its scheduled SRA by desperate Pentagon military planners. This devastating decision aggressively turned minor mechanical wear and tear into critical system failures across the board. By October, the administration redirected the exhausted crew to the Caribbean for unexpected counter-narcotics patrol missions. The current op-tempo is simply unsustainable for an 11-carrier fleet operating in a chaotic two-front geopolitical landscape. This grueling new op-tempo forced an intense mission profile that no supercarrier had ever successfully sustained at this scale. And then, before the desperately needed maintenance teams could run depot-level inspections, Operation Epic Fury violently arrived. The massive supercarrier did not return home for its vital repairs, but was instead aggressively pushed further into the volatile East. Tracing the path of the USS Gerald R reveals an exhausting 283 days across 3 distinct theaters of operation. The massive supercarrier was initially supposed to handle standard operations safely within the calm waters of the Mediterranean theater. However, the strategic geometry was severely compromised when the USS George H.W. Bush failed to arrive at its designated maritime position. Consequently, the overworked crew on the Ford was aggressively ordered to cover the Caribbean before desperately rushing to the Red Sea. This relentless death march meant that one single vessel was performing the grueling duties of 2 massive ships without a single break. They navigated 3 totally different and incredibly hostile mission profiles across highly unpredictable and dangerous global waters. The overarching naval geometry was originally designed by the Pentagon to be completely unbreakable and capable of crushing any adversary. But because the third carrier was simply not available, the entire grand strategy immediately collapsed under its own impossible weight. By month 9, the mighty vessel, covering 2 separate combat positions, completely broke down from sheer physical and mechanical exhaustion. It catastrophically failed right before the needed relief carrier could finally arrive to take over the critical naval blockade mission. The true catastrophic failure was not within the massive nuclear reactor or the advanced electromagnetic launch system. It was deeply rooted in the accumulated fatigue of over 5,000 people pushed completely beyond human endurance. A minor laundry room fire is something any standard Nimitz-class carrier would have quickly and easily shrugged off. But this small, localized fire became the breaking point because the human organism surrounding the technology collapsed. When you keep a massive crew at sea for 9 straight months under intense combat stress, critical errors will happen. Routine daily maintenance inevitably gets gun-decked by completely exhausted sailors who are just trying to survive the shift. Minor mechanical wear cascades into a catastrophic operational shutdown when a sleep-deprived crew works without parts. The formidable defensive wall that finally fell was never knocked down by aggressive Iranian missiles or enemy actions. It was painfully and quietly worn down from the inside by an administration that entirely ignored the human element. While the Ford promises a higher surge sortie generation rate of 270 a day, that number is meaningless if the ship fails. That impressive figure becomes completely worthless if the massive ship's fragile internal ecosystem utterly collapses after month 6. Modern digital propulsion replaces the reliable steam catapult with an incredibly sophisticated linear induction motor control system. However, this generational leap forward depends heavily on a vast network of totally interdependent and delicate electronic subsystems. A traditional steam catapult fails in highly predictable ways that a standard mechanic can easily diagnose and repair with a wrench. The new electromagnetic system fails in rapid cascading ways that blindly propagate through complex power distribution architectures. The notorious laundry fire was not a localized hardware malfunction, but the undeniable symptom of an overburdened mechanical network. It dramatically proved that the advanced technology itself held strong while the massive human support organism finally broke apart. Nothing aboard that expensive ship was actually designed to run continuously for that intensely grueling duration without downtime. The ship sailing to fill this dangerous operational gap was originally built to be the absolute last of its kind. Commissioned nearly 2 decades ago, the USS George H.W. Bush is the ultimate legacy of the legendary Nimitz-class. The Pentagon planned for the futuristic Ford to easily replace the legacy ships, but legacies do not break at month 9. The strategic reality proves that availability beats capability when the optimal technological marvel is stuck in a dry dock. The legacy carrier spent the last 2 years safely docked at Norfolk, completing scheduled maintenance and certification. This massive vessel arrives completely fresh, and being fresh is an undeniable strategic asset in modern naval warfare. What this mighty warship does not bring is the advanced electromagnetic system or a ridiculously high surge sortie rate. It violently launches heavy attack aircraft with extremely loud and maintenance-intensive steam catapults from the past. However, this primitive mechanical system has produced 0 systemic failures that pulled a deployed carrier from combat. Over 50 years of robust steel hulls running this exact same primitive setup under sustained demand prove its true worth. The mighty Bush traded away the technological ceiling, but in exchange, the resilient legacy ship tightly kept the floor. Right now, with the glorious digital ceiling broken in a Croatian shipyard, the solid mechanical floor is what we need. The tragic repositioning of the fleet created a massive and extremely dangerous void in the broader geopolitical landscape. When the broken Ford quickly withdrew from the vital Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the aggressive Houthis immediately sensed weakness. The presence of a massive supercarrier is absolute deterrence, and its sudden absence is an open invitation for conflict. The strategic coffin requiring 3 synchronized supercarriers was completely destroyed because we only had 2 on the map. The USS Abraham Lincoln boldly locked down the vital Strait of Hormuz from the east, but the western flank was wide open. With the Ford crippled in a distant shipyard and the Bush far away in the Mediterranean, the critical corridor remained empty. This vulnerable choke point controls 12% of global trade, and hostile forces are already probing our defenses. The Houthis aggressively launched heavy ballistic missiles and swarms of armed drones, violently targeting vulnerable Israeli positions. This direct escalation clearly demonstrates that an empty space on the tactical map rapidly leads to catastrophic real-world results. We traded true global dominance for a broken geometry that cannot protect the most critical shipping lanes on the planet. The devastating incident did not prove that the futuristic carrier is completely unreliable in standard combat. It dramatically proved that the aggressive modernization thesis contained a massive assumption we never tested. Military planners foolishly assumed you could seamlessly replace reliable mechanical simplicity with digital complexity. They wanted fewer moving parts, but created vastly more interdependent subsystems across the entire combat vessel. A traditional mechanical clock has 12 simple gears, and if one single gear breaks, you can easily hear it and fix it. A digital clock has absolutely no moving gears, but depends entirely on a hidden battery and complex circuit boards. When that invisible battery finally drains after 9 grueling months, the entire digital system suddenly goes dark at once. There is absolutely no early warning and no broken mechanical gear to loudly alert the heavily exhausted maintenance crew. This catastrophic scenario highlights the massive difference between a mechanical failure and a total systemic collapse. The mighty USS Gerald R. Ford furiously operated for 283 days without anyone replacing the battery. The Pentagon traded away essential mechanical endurance just to achieve a much higher theoretical combat capability metric. The brutal lesson of this modern naval warfare is that survival heavily favors the system that can outlast the opponent. $13 billion bought the highest sortie rate ever achieved, but completely ignored the realities of human fatigue. The vicious proxy war being fought right now is aggressively testing a totally different and extremely uncomfortable question. The ultimate tactical query is not how fast you can launch expensive jets, but exactly how long your fragile system can last. The incredibly resilient ship accurately answering that vital question is ironically the last one built from the distant past. The USS George H.W. Bush is stepping up to hold the line, proving that decades of refined engineering can outwork untested innovation. This deployment begs a critical question for the future of the U.S. Navy when the immense pressure of modern global combat is finally on. The next shipbuilding budget has to answer honestly if we are trading away essential fleet endurance for maximum theoretical capability. Should Congress halt the production of the next Ford-class carriers and simply go back to building the incredibly battle-proven Nimitz? Or are these catastrophic growing pains just the completely unavoidable and acceptable financial cost of necessary military modernization? Drop your detailed tactical assessment in the comments below, and I will definitely pin the absolute best strategic argument to the top.